Kia ora. Hello. Today we are beginning a project I'm really passionate about, discussing the rise of the middle class in medieval Europe. It could be said our video on confraternities last week is part of the series, as it does tie in with the Guild's medieval odes and the structure of medieval society. I will include it in this playlist. This is the official starting point of the series, so let's just kick off. As always, all sources and further reading are linked below in the description. It is easy today to look at the modern city, an edifice which dominates political, social, and economic landscapes of our nations, and assume that these behemoths would be integral to any society and civilization. This is true in most cases. Cities are the heart of centralized government, as demonstrated by the Bronze Age collapse and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. For example, cities are abandoned as populations become decentralized and more agrarian. As we are talking about the rise of the medieval city, first we need to address the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. I'm sure this is probably going to upset some people. Rome really did not fall. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse. The empire dissolved into regional self-governing provinces, while the Eastern Empire continued until the 15th century. These provinces ceased to be governed by Latin Roman governors. Instead, Germanic migrants that had arrived became the governors, usually under the title of Kaiser or Dux or König, or other such grandiose assumption. These kings strove to maintain Roman cities and society. They understood that by maintaining the society, they could maintain the wealth they had arrived to conquer. But I hear you ask, what about the Dark Ages? Rome fell and Europe was all mud and blood and guts because the golden light of Rome fell. Tosh, I say, romantic Victorian nonsense. There was no fall of Rome. There was no Dark Age. This is just Eurocentric nonsense anyway. Maybe I need to do a video on why the Dark Ages was made up. And not just by Victorians, but by late medieval and Renaissance scholars. So, comment below if you'd like to see this video. What does this have to do with the rise of the medieval city? For the medieval city to rise, we need the ancient city to fall. This is a wholly complex subject which I will do my best to condense. This topic will involve other videos. For the ancient Roman city to fall, we need the failure of three key infrastructures: the loss of the power of the Roman slave network, the loss of the Roman military, and the loss of the Roman trade networks. Here I'm going to discuss points 2 and 3. Point 1 will be discussed in depth when we delve into feudalism. However, in short, point 1 amounts to, with the loss of the slave labor forces, Roman cities and infrastructure and industry ceased to function. Slave labor accounted for 100% of the labor force, including food production. So what are you going to do? With the decentralization of power, there is no single authority to respond to threats. The power of Rome lay in the military of Rome, to mobilize an armed force and to protect its cities and assets. Cities no longer became the places of safety, as there was no military force protecting these cities. People turned to local warlords and fortified monasteries for protection, as banditry and localized warfare increased. Without the protection of the Roman military to keep the roads and trade routes secure, trade started to become more dangerous. Cities relied on trade to supply themselves with basic goods to survive. Even the staple of the Roman city, wheat, was traded. Cities starved and the populations had to turn to farming to survive. The final killing blow to Europe and the city itself was twofold. First came in the 7th century. The Islamic expansion cut Western Europe off to the Mediterranean trade routes and the Silk Road to the south. Later, in the 8th and 9th centuries, the subsequent Viking expansion cut Europe off in the north. Essentially, Europe became isolated from the rest of the world. Once it enjoyed millennia of transcontinental trade as far back as the Neolithic, now it had to rely on its own resources. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to jump ahead to the 11th century here. I will mention, however, prior to this period, the Merovingian and the Carolingian empires, and in particular, the work of Charlemagne, and what he undertook to restore the Roman systems of law in the Western Empire. However, as we know, on his death, his empire crumbled and his lands carved up into the hands of warlords. His system of government was not through, however. His legacy survived, and the ideas of Charlemagne were returned to by kings and lawmakers through the medieval period, as was his way to lend legacy to their laws and to the state. I did say I was going to be brief, so on to the 11th century. Feudalism had been established, and the church had declared the pacts of the peace of God and the truce of God, which formed the basis of chivalry. The first crusades had happened. This has opened Europe back up to the Levant. The added side effect is there were less rebel knights charging all over the countryside, wholesale robbing and raiding and making just a general nuisance of themselves. This allows for traders to begin to engage in trade in a much safer and organised manner. People, as I have mentioned, moved to fortified positions for safety. This is no more than proto-cities or towns in many places. People are still scattered and largely agrarian. It is in the 12th century that the city starts to grow in power, with the foundations of Charlemagne and the greatest excesses of the robber barons curtailed by the Crusades and the church in the 10th and 11th centuries. We would not see the explosion of trade and the learning that led to the 12th century Renaissance. During this period, we see people suddenly settle new cities and revitalize old ones. What were once fortified castles or burgs overflow with people. So much so that the walls of these towns could no longer contain the residents, building new homes outside the walls. Craftspeople and traders moved to the cities and begin to centralize the efforts of trade and commerce. This is really important as merchants occupy a space in feudal life outside the feudal system. They were travelers and did not have access to the normal legal protections that the system afforded a bonded person. When the merchants and tradespeople start to collect in towns, they were able to pool their resources. During this period, their usefulness and the wealth that they bring to the feudal lords allow for them, that is to say the merchants and tradespeople, to band together and gain legitimacy in society. Medieval towns begin to purchase the right to become economic communes. Others had the inhabitants banding together and demand this right. Northern Italy had already established commune cities by the 11th century. This process continued through the 12th century and into the 13th century. Not all medieval cities became communes, mind you. London famously purchased the right to become a commune city, while Paris was never declared a commune. So now we are at the point where we can see that ancient cities have declined and the factors that have contributed to that. We can also see medieval cities are rising again. Again, with the establishing of trade and a workforce, the two things that a city needs to keep it going. Now we come to the discussion of military, the third pillar. As we know, there is no real centralized military during this period. This is where the proposition of the commune city is important, as these are not just economic and government structures, they are also created for self-defense. These walled towns organize their own militias, and should a local lord threaten or perpetrate violence, the townsfolk were not afraid to exact revenge, burning and robbing his holdings in retaliation. These communes were also granted freedoms from feudal rule. Medieval cities became a beacon of the ideals of freedom. It has become a custom that if one were to flee a city for a year and a day without being caught and sent home to your master, you were now accounted a freeman. So the saying went, city air should make you free. And so it went, more people left the land to the cities. As was discussed in our videos on the plague, there was a large migration during the middle of the 14th century. A significant number of people fled the land for the cities after the plague, either to escape servitude or in search of higher pay. It is during the 14th century we see a great disruption in the distribution of wealth, as many people either inherited or found abandoned resources after the great mortality of the plague. This brings more money into the cities and inevitably drives further trade. If by the beginning of the 14th century the medieval city was not already the most important edifice in medieval society, by the middle of this period it has well been established as such. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below. We would really like to grow this channel, so if you enjoy what you see, we would love if you could comment or share. Otherwise, see you next time, and remember, stay safe, have fun, and keep reenacting.